Hello everyone, welcome to this video. This is a continuation of a series of videos using the Multistory Builder. In the previous video, we actually looked at how we can use elevation views to generate our own custom grid folders, as you can see here, for elevations, as well as defining geometry in an elevation. So we added some eccentric steel bracing onto the edge of our podium. Now we're going to turn our attention to some of the editing tools that are available within this workflow. And just like before, a lot of this revolves around the use of grids. We've defined grids in this model. As you can see, we're looking at the base grid folder. And maybe I'll just open the edit grids dialog here, and we can see that we have 3 base grids, or what I call child grids, and we have our main base grid, or parent grid. So these 3 grid sets underneath represent the core, the power, and the podium. They all have different spacing, and you'll notice for each one of them I've defined grid increments. I've also defined for several of them offsets. As you can see with the podium, I've offset it 30 meters to basically sit next to my tower. The same thing for my core. I've lined it up so that it basically is centered within my tower. Now we do have other editing controls, like we can define our own custom grid lines. We can define labels or even extensions or change the bubble size. I'm not going to get into that in this video. What we're really looking at is using these grids to edit our geometry. So I specified this grid increments here, and that just allows me to essentially left click and drag my grids in order to adjust the dimensions of the geometry associated with each. So I can click OK to escape out of here, and you'll notice that maybe I'll switch to, I'll keep in my base grids folder, but you'll notice here that I have my grid lines currently unlocked. What this means is that I'm actually able to left click and drag on a grid line, and it's going to allow me to essentially modify the geometry for this. So for this example here, why don't I just look at a top view, and I'll just switch to this view here, and I'm going to grab grid line 15. And with grid line 15 selected here, actually before I grab it, I should note that I have the extend grids option toggled on. And I've also got the unlocked grids option toggled on. So the grids are free to move, and it's going to drag the joints with them. And because I have extend grid scopes turned on as well, it's also going to drag joints that are in that same line along as well, even if they're not within the scope of this grid. So with grid line 15 here, I'm just going to left click and I drag, and you notice I have the ordinates of this grid line here being dragged over, and this is what I would refer to as a planar move of my geometry. So I left click here and I place it down, and the joints attached to that will move with it. Notice here that I actually had in line with this grid line 15, I had this patio with the sun deck that also moved with it. I can click undo to undo that change. And if I wanted to make an additional change and say, rather than adjusting just a plane of geometry, I want to adjust a volume, I can left click on the same grid line 15, but hold down shift before I do so, and left click and drag. And when I do this, notice that not only is the plane of geometry along grid line 15 moving, but the volume on the left side of it in the direction I'm moving. So it allows for easy modifications done graphically to our structure. I'm just going to click undo again. And one thing I do want to note is that if you don't intend to adjust your geometry using this type of capability, I would suggest that you toggle off this unlock grid option here. And this way, when I just left click and drag, it's not going to modify the geometry. It's really only when you want to make those changes that you should have that option turned on. And a lot of this does also revolve around the use of some additional commands like the expand grid scope. So if I go back to the grid dialog here, or extend grid scope, sorry, and I'm looking at the podium, or sorry, the core, maybe just so I can see everything here. This is my core wall, and you can see that it's got its own grid defined. I've got the grid increments defined, and I've got an offset defined as well. So this has been positioned to be located centrally within my tower. But as always, there are architectural changes that come about that might require us to use a different grid, maybe a different layout, something that might have changed along the way that no longer reflects our original model. And it's quite easy to do in S-Frame using this grid definitions dialog or the editing of the grids. So again, I have the lock joints to grids option turned on, but I've toggled off lock grid so those grids aren't being locked. And I'm just going to click OK here. And I'm going to select my core. And I'm going to turn off the display of my hidden surface removal so I can clearly see my grid. And just like before, we can left click on a grid line, and let's just assume here that I want to modify the location of this core. So I'm going to move basically grid line 1 and everything on the right side of it by left clicking this line with the shift key held down and move it to the right. So hold down shift, I'll left click on this grid line 1 and I'm going to move it, and you can see, let's just move it, in this case here, 1 meter to the right. And you'll notice when I did that, it did indeed move that core to the right, but it also dragged other geometry with it. That wasn't my intention. So I'm just going to click undo. And this goes back to the usage of the extend grid scope option. So with this option turned on, it's essentially, when it's toggled on, it's essentially going to look at all of the geometry that shares a plane with this grid that I've currently got selected, and look at basically where these grid lines, if they were to extend to infinity, where they cross other bits of geometry, so other joints on our model. And it will grab that and move it with it. So you can see here there are joints that are indeed associated with this geometry, and it's going to move those with it. Now that wasn't my intention. So in this example here, the extend grid scope is better to be turned off, because I just want to focus in on this more narrow scope of the grid itself and not the infinite length grid lines. So I'll click OK with this option, and then I'll retry that approach, changing it, and I'll go back to 16 meters. And you can see when I made that modification, it was able to move just the core without anything with it. And of course, I could have simply just gone with the X offset that I defined here as well. But I go back, and we'll stay with this grid layout for now. The last modification that we did want to make in this example here is actually on the roof level. So let me just change my view. Go with a side view here. And I'm going to unselect everything except for the top floor here. I'm just going to select just a row of data on the top floor, and just to help me out with this process as well, I'm going to move my user coordinate system to the top. So I'm just going to left click on the UCS tool, and I'm going to place my user coordinate system in one of these joints, this guy right here. And what I want to do is I want to apply a slope to these objects on this floor. So to do this, I have just selected this one set of objects, and I'm going to go to the Edit menu under the Move command. And under this command here, this dialog allows me the option to define a slope. And I can define slopes in different planes, essentially. So I select which plane I'd like to select, or to work with. In this case here, I'm going to go with the XZ plane. And then I define a slope in the direction that I want it to be in as well. So in this situation here, I'm going to go in the Z option, and I'm going to apply a 10% slope, so 0.1 times X, and click OK. And you can see here we now have a slope defined on this particular plane. Might be more obvious if we were to look at the hidden surface removal, and we'll be able to see what we're working with, perhaps in 3D as well. And so I can look at a side view and see what we're working with there, and select just the objects that I might be interested in again. And once I'm done, I can just click the undo button to return back to what I had originally. And if we wanted to edit our geometry in the vertical direction as well, another option for us is to go back here. I'll just select the entire structure, is to go back to the floor definitions. So I'm just going to look at this elevation view for now, and I'm going to go to the floor plan tool. And under the floor plan tool, you may remember that we have all these different floor definitions with their floor spacing and their floor level. So for example here, I could take floor number 7 and I can change this floor spacing to something exceedingly large, let's say 20 meters. So I'll type in 20 meters, all the floor levels above that will update. So now my building is taller. And then when I click anywhere else to end that command, even before I close this dialog, I can see a rendering of what that looks like. And that was deliberately large just for visual effect, but you can see how that would look. I'm going to change this back to 4 meters. And we can also modify the floor level, and the floor spacing will be modified with that. One example of this could be that we want to change the base elevation. So rather than starting at 0 meters, maybe we start at 10 meters below 0. So negative 10 meters. And again, every floor level has dropped another 10 meters. When I click outside of this cell, I can see what that looks like. And if I just go back to once I go back out of here, my UCS is actually way above, but my floor spacing hasn't been changed, just the elevation of each has changed. So this makes it easy for us to modify these types of vertical geometries, not only the horizontal geometries that we saw at the grids, but the vertical geometries after we've created the model. So I'm just going to set this back to 0, and everything updates once again, and I'll click OK.